All right, so welcome to today's CBCS seminar. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where everyone is today. I'm currently joining you from Larrakia land in Darwin. Those of you in Brisbane will be on traditional lands of the Turrbal Yagara people, but I'm sure people are also in many other places. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, existing and emerging leaders, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be on the seminar today. Our speaker today is Dr. Sean Maxwell. For the last 2 years, Sean worked as a postdoc research fellow in James Watson's research group, Greenfire Science. This work over the last 2 years has focused on assessing area-based conservation interventions and policy and qualifying the carbon benefits of retaining large tracts of intact forests across the global tropics. Looking ahead, Sean continues to work on land use solutions to global climate change and biodiversity loss, and is increasingly interested in how local coordinated management of agricultural landscapes can make meaningful contributions to international environmental goals. So without further ado, I will turn over to Sean, and it looks like your presentation's up and running. Looks perfect.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot, Misha. I'm joining you all from what a rural country down here in southwestern Victoria. So yeah, great to be chatting with you today. Today's presentation will be about area-based conservation. I guess right from the start, I should say that is like a lot of fields in conservation, the terminology is important and it's sometimes not consistent. What we're talking about today is protected areas and what are known as other area-based conservation measures. So we'll get into that a bit more, but just right from the start, that's what we're talking about, and how we've performed in that space with protected areas and OECMs in the last decade, and what the future looks like for them. This work was, it's a large collaborative effort, including from a few people from CBCS, Martine and Amelia, and James Watson is the senior author on this piece. So yeah, we've worked pretty hard on it, and I'm looking forward to sharing the findings with you today. Just as a bit of an introduction, protected areas are now cover around about 15-16% of terrestrial surface and around 8% of the marine realm. Here's how they look in space, with the different colours noting areas that have sort of expanded in the last decade. They carry a very, very strict definition. If you're prepared to read all the formal documents around this sort of stuff, the definition for protected areas is a clearly defined geographical space, recognised, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So that's the formal definition. That's what nations use to sort of, when they're reporting on this stuff. There's of course 6 different categories of protected areas. If we look at this little diagram here showing degree of naturalness of the environment or the habitat, you can see these different categories here, 1 through to 6, in theory are supposed to be placed in this kind of setup where you've got categories 5, the lower categories, this end of the spectrum in sort of relatively least natural conditions, and the higher management categories down here where conditions are most natural. Anyone who's worked with protected area data before will know that not all nations apply these guidelines consistently, but at least there is a framework there, and it's quite sound. It's but yeah, useful to be aware of. These sort of, they're not emerging. They've been well known for at least a decade now. But these other effective conservation measures, OECMs, are really people are quite excited by them because it does present a different type of area-based conservation intervention. There's only 146 that have been formally recognised so far. They're all in Canada, and here's a map of them at the moment. Given the sort of given that they're all in Canada at the moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking that what's the big deal, but nations do really have their eyes on these OECMs, as particularly in the next decade, sorry. So we were going to talk about them a little bit today. Their official definition is a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socio-economic, and other locally relevant values. You might, again, unless you really look hard and you write across this stuff, you might not see a big difference between protected areas, PAs, and OECMs, but they are treated differently. They're viewed differently, whereas PAs are sort of gazetted or designated. OECMs are recognised. Those terms you'll hear throughout this presentation, and they have a meaning. So sorry to labour this point, but there is a big difference, and whereas in this presentation we'll collectively refer to PAs and OECMs as area-based conservation. OECMs are different. Just on a personal point, I don't really like the term OECM, and it is kind of under revision, active revision at the moment. People are trying to find out what do you actually call these things. I like the term conserved area, so then you have PAs and CAs maybe. Other effective conservation measures, it sounds like an afterthought right from the start. So, but anyway, it's an opportunity nonetheless, and something that's sort of really, in my mind, something at the forefront of area-based conservation policy and planning for this next decade. That's all I wanted to say for this introduction. Except, I will touch on why they actually matter. I guess really broadly, they are a very intuitive, tangible, and usually quite permanent conservation intervention. I say intuitive because you can ask a 5-year-old how you save a species, and they'll probably say look after the home, and just having an area set aside for a species is a very intuitive way, and it's you can draw it on a map, you can measure it, you can quantify it. That's what I mean by intuitive and tangible. And it's also something that's usually legally protected in perpetuity. But again, there's that's now changing in certain in some cases, and we'll talk about that later on. But because of these attributes, they're intuitive, intangible, and permanent. They they appeal, and they align well with the way governments view the world and how they manage their portfolios and whatnot. So in that sense, that they get some traction with governments. They're also quite an effective conservation intervention. Again, anyone who knows anything that has read it around in this space will know that is a pretty loaded term, effective, and it's up. There's a lot of debate around what is effective, what is not, and we'll talk about that. There's also some problems with area-based conservation. The three I've listed here are probably the big ones. They include resource and management shortfalls, poor placement of where these area-based conservation measures are, and also some social equity issues that are becoming more well known, but still it's sort of unclear just how pervasive they are and what the solutions are to them. So these problems here, and along with them being effective and kind of intuitive action, means they garner a lot of attention from governments, which led them to be incorporated into the HE targets. HE target 11 talked about area-based conservation. The deadline for these targets is 2020, so it's now essentially, and then we're talking about getting a new framework for biodiversity conservation as we speak. There's supposed to be some virtual meetings in November about discussing the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Then there might be a physical meeting in the first half of next year. But ultimately, whatever the zero draft, this post-2020 biodiversity framework looks like, we want to be able to learn from what made area-based conservation successful, what were the failures in the past decade, and in particular, how do we actually resolve these problems that have seemed apparent, and not just in the last decade, but for a long time before that as well. So we're motivated to do this work to sort of review these problems and try and make sure that, given that this framework will define the next decade of national conservation agendas and planning, we want to make sure that area-based conservation, given that that is often at the foundation of many national conservation strategies, we want to make sure we learn from our mistakes and make them as effective as possible. So we've got a review in Nature that's in press coming out. We're not sure yet, but yeah, we'll be able to talk about the results today, which is exciting. As a bit of an overview, I'll first talk about the performance of protected areas in the last decade. That section is just talking about protected areas. The OECMs, given as I showed you the map earlier, they're not truly global in their extent yet, in their formal recognition anyway. So that part of the discussion is just talking about protected areas. We'll then talk about lessons learned and priority actions for area-based conservation. The immediate actions that need to be done now to start making improvements. And then we'll start talking about some more longer term general goals and objectives that nations should be thinking about when they're thinking about area-based conservation. So getting back to this HE target 11, a lot of you will be familiar with it, but we're going to step through it the way we I said we talk about the performance of protected areas. By that, I mean, how well did nations go at delivering on this target? So by 2020, at least 17% of land, 10% of water is conserved, and we want to target areas that are important for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Want to be equitably managed. We want to be ecologically representative and well connected. That's the essence of this target. We could have a whole separate discussion on whether it's a good target or not, how it can be improved, but this is what drove the national agenda for area-based national agendas for area-based conservation in the past decade. So we want to assess against that. Let's first look at this one. Did we get 17% of land, 10% of water? Well, we got about, in the last decade, from 2010 to 2020, terrestrial protected area state increased from 14.1 to 15.3% of land. That's land and freshwater environments globally. In the marine realm, we had a much larger increase from around 3% to 7.5%. So fell short of our goals, but in the marine realm in particular, some growth, which is good, but still fell short. This is how it breaks down by nation: European nations, Asian nations, South America, and we've got African nations over here. And the green bars represent the terrestrial states, and the blues to purples are all marine. And the nations that are below this sort of shaded area haven't got 17% of their land protected. Now, I don't know if it's worth mentioning, but the idea that each nation has to have 17% of their land protected is not formally written down anywhere. It's kind of just assumed that that's the way the target is interpreted, and it will be, but it doesn't have to be that way. And yeah, we can have a talk about that, whether we, with area-based conservation, we should adopt a more shared but unequal responsibility approach like we do with the climate. But at the moment, at least, most nations are striving, if they've signed up to the HE targets, to have 17% of the land protected, 10% of the marine system protected. So still quite a few nations that are falling short of that 17%, a few that have met it, some have exceeded it. And in the marine realm, these little asterisks notify landlocked countries. Again, similar pattern, some doing really, really well, and others that are falling short. And this here is the high seas and Antarctica story, where Antarctica met, probably a lot thanks to a lot of work from CBCS and the crew down in Tassie there. A lot of energy, a lot of investment in protecting the seas around Antarctica, which is a good outcome. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the target, areas of particular importance for biodiversity. Again, this is not a discussion about target semantics, but that's not really quantifiable. But we can still make guesses as to what areas of particular importance for biodiversity are. We chose to look at key biodiversity areas. So KBAs, it's a global approach for standardising the identification of marine, terrestrial and freshwater sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. So they're mapped, and there's quite a few of them, about 15,000 of them. Most of them are for important bird areas, so which was the precursor to KBAs, but at any rate, they are viewed that governments care about these things, and there is a lot of effort going into making sure that the guidelines for identifying KBAs are implemented properly, and yeah. So we assess the coverage of these KBAs. They're not expected to be all covered in protected areas, but we nonetheless wanted to see how well they're covered. So between 2010 and 2020, terrestrial protected areas, the average coverage of KBAs increased from 43.6% to 45.9%, which is pretty good. Again, the nations aren't required to have all of them in protected areas, but if these are really important sites for biodiversity, you know, and they're half protected, maybe we need to think about that. In the marine realm, the average protection for a KBA increased from 37.9 to 43.4% in the last decade. It might be worth noting that there's about 5,000 KBAs, or about a third of all KBAs remain without any protection in 2020. So that might be worth, not really a good outcome in that respect. In terms of other areas that are important for biodiversity, we chose to look at wilderness areas, both terrestrial and marine. Again, driven by a lot of work from our CBCS, is we now know wilderness areas are these ecologically intact land and seascapes. They're free of human physical disturbance. A lot of them underpin planetary life support systems, and they're quite critical for long-term persistence of species that, wide-ranging species, and species that are threatened by climate change. Our analysis showed that the coverage of terrestrial wilderness areas increased from 19.7 to 22.1% in the last decade. And marine wilderness areas, the coverage was increased from 2% to 8.5%. So some pretty good gains there. And in both cases, coverage of these wilderness areas is greater than you would expect by random. So again, we can have a big discussion about whether that flags that nations are just pushing these protected areas away from where we want development, or they're actually targeting these wilderness areas that are important for biodiversity. In another discussion we can have, there's some work being done by Katarina Victoria, who, she's actively doing some work on trying to tease out what within the wilderness landscape and seascapes, what areas are important for biodiversity and what are not. So that should be something to look forward to. We also assessed areas that are important for ecosystem services. Again, it's kind of difficult to sort of just select one or two of ecosystem services, but we basically just chose the ones that we know we had reasonable data on, spatial data on. We started with coverage of global above ground biomass and carbon stocks. So here we have a global map. The shading, the white to black shading underneath is soil, by above ground biomass and soil carbon in the landscape. The yellow is the protected area state. We can see that some of the areas we know are important, at least above ground biomass carbon, have reasonable protection through the tropics here, perhaps not through Southeast Asia. These large repositories in Papua New Guinea and in Indonesia, particularly soil carbon here, peat carbon is huge, and there's unprotected repositories there. But yeah, on average, about 24%, sorry, of biomass carbon was inside protected areas by 2020, and around 14.5% of soil carbon was within protected areas by 2020. So perhaps just over, just slightly more than random for the biomass carbon and less for the soil carbon. We also looked at the coverage of the biological pump in the marine realm. So the biological pump is essentially when phytoplankton fix carbon in the ocean, and then that carbon, some of it is exported down deep into the ocean and can help, and it can stay there for decades to millennia. So that process, that fixation of carbon by phytoplankton, and then the sequestration, or not sequestration, but the removal from the atmosphere into the deep ocean, does help mitigate climate change. We wanted to assess the coverage of that process. The biological pump is made up of the removal of particulate organic carbon and dissolved organic carbon. And we get into a bit more detail on this in the paper. But essentially, we think that within protected areas, there's around 0.21 gigatons or petagrams of particulate organic carbon and around 2 petagrams of dissolved organic carbon that are being exported essentially permanently from the atmosphere and into the deep ocean every year. So that again is about what you'd expect given the coverage of the marine protected area state. It's slightly more than in some areas, but yeah, and it's a shame I can't really get into the heterogeneity of these sort of services, but yeah, perhaps as we in future talks, and we can just talk about one of these findings, be that coverage of biodiversity or ecosystem services, really get into it. But these are the overarching figures, at least. We also looked at coverage of fisheries, given the importance of fisheries of wild caught and farmed seafood to people globally. What we want to do with this one is compare protected area coverage of the most and the least productive marine regions for fisheries catch. We found that coverage of the least productive exclusive economic zones was on average 3 times greater than the coverage of the most productive EEZs. We defined the most productive, what the least productive EEZ was if they're in the bottom 20% of catch per unit area, annual catch per unit area, we consider that a least productive EEZ. So yeah, coverage of these zones was 3 times greater than the most productive ones, and also that coverage of the most productive zones hasn't changed much in the last decade. We also found that the 7 most productive pelagic regions, so this is areas outside of EEZs, have no formal protected area coverage. So it's a bit to digest there, sorry, but essentially you've got exclusive economic zones, those areas about 200 kilometres out from your country border. We looked at protection of those, but also in the high seas, essentially in pelagic zones, we looked at coverage of these and whether they coverage seems to target highly productive fisheries or not. 7 most productive pelagic regions fisheries have no formal protected area coverage, which we thought was a bit concerning. Okay, getting on to whether or not protected areas are effectively managed. It all depends on how you measure effectiveness. We talk about in the paper, there's about 4 different ways to measure effectiveness. In this particular section, we'll talk about 3 of those. The first is if you're just looking at inputs. So the inputs of protected areas, how whether they're good enough to effectively manage a site. And the answer is probably no. There's some recent studies showing that if you just look at the inputs of protected areas, around 23% of terrestrial protected areas suffer from inadequate staff and budget resources, and that these shortfalls are particularly pronounced in the neotropics. This is my attempt at a joke here. We've got this chap with these pretty rudimentary equipment, and it just made me think that maybe governments still view staff budgets as this is all I need: a rollout swag, a little push bike, and a shotgun. The way that a lot of protected areas are funded, you'd think that that's all they'd require. And similarly, we found these sort of resource shortfalls. We didn't find them. Other studies have, which we profile in the review, that they're found in the marine realm as well. There's a review of 433 marine protected areas, showing that 65% have an insufficient budget for basic management needs, and around 91% have on-site staff capacity that is inadequate or below optimum. So just pointing to the old sailboats here and whether they're just not fit for the job. Moving on. This is so that's if you're just looking at inputs. But if we look at the ability of protected areas to reduce threats to landscapes, habitat, species. Some work done by Kenny Jones a few years ago showed that around a third of all protected areas, around a third of all protected areas are under intense human pressure, and that human pressure is increased inside protected areas. There's around 55% of protected areas between 1993 and 2009. And we find in the marine realm that over 90% of protected areas still permit fishing activities. It's a bit hard to really get your hands on what sort of fishing activities are permitted, but given that, that there is ambiguity around there, maybe it's safe to assume that still it's quite some, well, we'd like to see clearer guidelines anyway around fishing, given its effect on its potential to affect habitats and species probability of persistence. That being said, we do know that terrestrial protected areas do reduce rates of deforestation and forest degradation compared to those observed in nearby unprotected areas. And that's including in some of the real important areas of forests throughout the tropics, especially the Amazon and through the Central Africa. We also know that marine protected areas do reduce fishing vessels and can, in some cases, reduce the negative effects of quite damaging non-native species. Some work by Sylvain, some of her work, which is a previous CBCS member, helped to really draw some attention to that. Okay, moving on. So got 2 slides dedicated to management effectiveness. We're going to go now. So we've talked about inputs, we've talked about threat reduction, and now we're going to talk about outcome evaluation. So whether or not protected areas are having an effect over and above what would be happening in their absence. A study out last year by Jonas Geldman and colleagues showed that some 12,000 protected areas were ineffective at reducing human pressures inside their borders between 1995 and 2010. What we're looking at here is a figure. You've got a measure of human pressure down below and all the different regions around the world, and a tally for global. The light brown areas, really what you really want to concentrate on is a comparison between the green and the light brown. That's just showing what human pressure is like on average in protected area states in these different regions, inside protected areas and matched regions that are biophysically similar but non-protected. And one of the shocking results for this study is that globally, pressure increases, which albeit it was between only tells us information between 95 and 2010, but that protected areas were on average unable to prevent human pressure increases inside their borders. Some regions that's not the case, but regions that we know are important for biodiversity, Indo-Malaya, Afrotropics, they were quite a lot. The pressure increases are actually a lot greater inside protected areas than outside. So that's concerning. But on the plus side, we've got some positive news. This is the results from Gray et al. Study, 2016, I think. Now, this study showed that species richness and population abundance are both greater inside protected areas than their matched regions outside. So that's a good thing, and that is sort of consistent across these different protected area categories, more or less. We've also got from the marine realm study Gill et al. in 2017. This is a review of a controlled study of 218 marine protected areas. It showed that on average fish biomass is nearly double inside protected areas than in non-protected sites. So yeah, that's a good thing, and again, that's quite consistent across these different regions of the world. That's a good finding. So that's just looking at MPAs that prohibit fishing. Sadly, as we just found, the previous slide showed that only 10%, even less, of MPAs actually prohibit fishing. But when they do prohibit fishing, they work quite well, if we're looking at fish biomass at least. And other positive news though, marine protected areas can promote the recovery of commercial fish species. No-take marine reserves in particular can effectively increase species richness and density and biomass in both tropical and temperate systems. And they can be effective at restoring trophic function and lowering levels of coral disease. There's been very few studies on this, the outcomes of social impact, social metrics from protected areas. When I say outcomes, I mean controlled studies. We got matched sites or other techniques to avoid confounding variables. But some of the studies that have done this looked at the social impacts of protected areas. There was a study of 603 protected areas found that households near protected areas with tourism opportunities had higher wealth levels and a lower likelihood of poverty than similar households living far from protected areas. So there's certainly quite a lot of potential there. Now we'll get on to whether protected areas have been equitably managed. So we're talking about social equity here. Again, the studies in this space aren't as numerous as they should be. There was a recent study that looked at 225 protected areas, showing that the majority of conservation managers, staff and community representatives believe protected area benefits are shared equally. So that's a good thing. You don't have scenarios like this where only the money's just going to the top. But the study also showed that decision-making was not equitable. And in many cases, local stakeholders perceived a general loss of rights over natural resources after protected area establishment. So this is what I flagged earlier around social issues. And these really need to be better avoided, better managed if area-based conservation is to be truly effective in the next few decades. We do know that protected areas that do integrate local communities as stakeholders often result in better social, socioeconomic and conservation outcomes. There was a review of 27 marine protected areas that found that stakeholder engagement, surveillance, leadership, political will, and the existence of sanctioning and conflict resolution mechanisms are the key factors to achieving ecological objectives. So when you get the social elements right, you get both the benefits for the human communities and the ecological communities as well. Okay, moving on to whether or not protected areas are ecologically representative. Again, there's different ways to do this. We assessed how expansion of the global protected area state between 2010 and 2019, 2020 affected coverage of threatened species. Over 12,000 threatened species listed as vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered. So in the last decade, the percentage of species with some proportion of their geographic range protected increased from 86% to 87.6%, which sounds high. But if we look at adequate representation, that is, if we look at a species distribution, we can assess how much of that distribution should be covered, ranging from 10% of that distribution if it's really widely ranging, up to 100% of that distribution if it's a very narrow range species. If we look at adequate coverage, only 21% or around 2,500 threatened species that we looked at had adequate coverage, which is increased from around 19% in 2010. So this is the breakdown by taxonomic group: corals, cartilaginous fish, mangroves, and marine bony fishes, seagrasses, marine mammals, marine reptiles. Here is the proportional increase of protection. We can see the corals done pretty well in the last decade. And as did cartilaginous fishes. This dotted line here indicates the relative increase, proportional increase, sorry, of the marine protected area state globally. So if you're above this line here, you can see that you might have been targeted in terms of you benefited relatively from the expansion of protected area state, whereas these ones here missed out. They were not found in many of the new protected area states between 2010 and 2020. So yeah, threatened reef-forming corals with adequate representation grew from 9% in 2010 to 44% in 2020. That's quite good. The proportion of species with adequate coverage also increased for threatened mangroves and seagrasses, and also marine mammals and fishes. But there's still at this stage no threatened marine reptiles that have adequate protection in 2020. So that's what this figure over here is trying to show. Over time, for all your different taxonomic groups, what your representation, adequate, the proportion of species with adequate representation as the protected area state grew in the marine realm. Now, if we look at the terrestrial realm, we looked at threatened freshwater species, threatened reptiles, birds, amphibians, and mammals. Again, this dotted line indicates the increase in the protected area state globe in the terrestrial realm. And we can see freshwater species done well relatively, but generally they're pretty much flat lines here. We had the number of species that have adequate representation didn't increase much in the terrestrial realm in the last decade. And yeah, it remains that about 78% of all threatened species that we assessed had inadequate protection as of 2020. And around 1,500 of these species, or around 12%, have no coverage at all. So yeah, it's still some red flags there. And now next part of the target, whether or not protected area states are well connected. We know that connected ecosystems are critical for maintaining important ecological and evolutionary processes. This include species migration, gene flow, especially when faced with rapid climatic and environmental change. Connectivity in the marine realm, my reading of it, it's not as not viewed as essential as connectivity in the terrestrial realm, but I'm sure, please jump in and shout me down if that's not the case. But we do know that at least it's in the marine realm, connectivity is important to replenish and maintain fish populations, and including for fish species. And the studies in this space show that around 30% of terrestrial ecoregions were at least 17% protected covered by protected areas that can be reached by species in a potential dispersal distance, and that the percentage of connected terrestrial protected areas increased from around 6 to 7% between 2010 and 2018. But those two studies that I'm referring to, they didn't actually account for the permeability of unprotected land between protected areas. I know Michelle Ward has a paper in review at the moment that looked at that permeability and actually accounted for it, and showed that on average around 11% of nations protected area states is only 11% is connected via intact land. So that using that metric would say that that's not connected enough. Not that the target gives an idea of how connected they should be. Is 10% well connected? I don't know. In the marine realm, we couldn't find any global studies of connectivity of marine and protected areas, but there's certainly regional scale assessments, and they show that marine protected areas have limited connectivity, especially for species with that disperse quite widely, or the dispersive larval stage. So that's a very long and drawn out summary of our results, but I hope you can see, we can really dig into this a lot more. But ultimately, if we look at it, everything, it's hard not. While there's been some national progress towards this target, but they've essentially failed to meet it. The rate of terrestrial protected area expansion needed to be double what it was in the past decade to achieve the 17% coverage of land and freshwater environments. And over 78% of known threatened species and more than half of all ecosystems on land and sea remain without adequate protection. So they're all things that point to a failure to reach this target, if we want to be blunt about it. We've got two lessons that emerged. The first of which is that nations need to expand area-based conservation efforts, and they need to better ensure that they contribute meaningfully to global goals for species and ecosystem conservation. And these goals range from just stopping extinction, getting the last of the habitat for species that are really under pressure, and ranging all the way out to keeping systems intact. We also know that a lot of protected areas are really poorly resourced, and this is leading to ineffective management, and that many Indigenous and community groups are inadequately or inequitably represented in management plans. So these are two clear things that emerge outside, I'm not giving the sandwich feedback here, sorry, but these are two big lessons that need to be addressed in the next decade of area-based conservation. And we think we've got three urgent challenges to sort of start addressing these concerns. And they are to make these OECMs really contribute meaningfully to biodiversity conservation, to track dynamism in area-based conservation effectively, and to focus on outcome-orientated evaluation of protected areas. So let me just back up here. So these are the three challenges, the immediate challenges I'll talk about. Talk about OECMs now. So I said that nations are really excited, and a lot of conservation scientists are excited by OECMs because they've got traction. Governments are keen to utilise it. Hopefully not to just as a way to reach their targets, but what's exciting about these areas is that they can really fill a lot of the gaps in the protected area system, whereas PAs in some circumstances can really grind with the social goals and objectives of land management, water management. OECMs are more flexible in that they by definition are required to be a way to conserve social cultural values whilst delivering biodiversity benefits as well. So that definition means that they can be placed in things like in a lot of the areas that are not represented in the protected area state. It's like farmland, provided that farmland is of value to biodiversity, other regions that are really poorly represented in the protected area state. So marine habitats and managed forests can also be recognised as OECMs. So that's a good thing. And another plus side is that from the OECMs that we know about, or at least Indigenous managed lands, they can support similar concentrations of vertebrate species and to nationally designated protected areas. So clearly very important to work with Indigenous peoples, local communities to have OECMs recognised. It provided that those groups of people support that and want it. But to deliver on the potential of OECMs, we've flagged a few things that really must be done. Governments, private industry and the conservation community must do immediately to ensure that OECMs can overcome the issues faced by the protected area state at the moment, primarily inadequate reporting and resourcing of these area-based conservation measures. There's a reporting platform that's been established for OECMs, that one that I showed the map earlier. We really need nations to engage with that platform to get the mapped out spatially OECMs. It's just Canada at this stage, really. Getting countries to engage with that platform and start recognising these sites and tracking them is a good thing. They'll also depend on governments and conservation actors upholding human rights and social safeguards, particularly Indigenous and community areas, to ensure that any action that's done in these sites align with what the management group need and want and support. In cases where meeting OECM criteria will require some adaptation of livelihoods, we need to take great care in ensuring that to develop alternative livelihoods and ensure those alternatives can actually deliver tangible benefits to resource users. And ensure that also those alternative livelihoods need to retain the biodiversity benefits of OECMs as well. Again, you saw from the previous slide, we don't really have a good way of measuring social equity at the moment. It's the people on the ground doing the hard work, social surveys that at the forefront of this. But and they've also done a lot of the intellectual work as well. They can break social equity down into different dimensions, and these include distributional equity. There's people agreeing on a scheme for sharing benefits and burdens. There's procedural equity, decision making that is transparent, accountable and participatory, and also having recognition as a part of the management plan, which is just respect for cultural identities, customary rights and traditional management practices. So that intellectual work and the surveys that are ongoing, that really needs to be recognised and adopted by nations as they move forward. Okay, so moving on, I want to make sure I'm not running out of time here, Misha. Am I doing okay?
We've got about 5 minutes left, so we won't have much time for questions unless you finish it off soon. So up to you, about 5 minutes.
All right, thanks, thank you. I'm going to whiz through this next one. Basically, protected area states, they've been long viewed as legally protected in perpetuity, but that's changing. Nations are finding ways to de-gazette or downgrade sites. This is a bit of work by Rachel Golden-Kroner and colleagues, and Mike Marsha and a few others have really led the way here. That dynamism is going on. We need to track that better. There's platforms to do that. We also suggest in the paper that we track incremental improvements in protected area states. So not just looking at downgrading and downsizing, but enhancement in that can we track better funding of under-resourced protected areas? Can we track improvements or expansion of protected area states better than we're doing at the moment? This last one, we're just tracking outcomes better. We need more match studies to properly track the biodiversity and social outcomes of protected areas. We talk about in the review some ways to do that. I'll now talk quickly about future proofing. I've focused on financing a fair bit. To me, this is the space that really needs a lot of research focus. We need to get more creative about how we fund protected areas. I don't think we can rely on governments putting up the money anymore. It doesn't really make sense, of course, if we look at what protected areas give us. So, you know, $600 billion is generated directly from visits to protected areas, according to some estimates. But there's, you know, it's probably between $100 and $200 million is spent on species protection. So there's a multi-billion-dollar shortfall, and we need to think about how we fund that. That's just from governments better recognising the values that they provide, but also getting creative about whether or not protected areas help prevent zoonotic diseases, and getting better at funding through development rather than just these offsetting. We look at the work of Martine and Jeremy are creating new ways to do that. Some of that can be funded into area-based conservation. We need to be climate smart, of course, thinking about how vulnerable, how to make sure species they don't become stranded assets, essentially. And finally, making biodiversity more mainstream. This is needed because we know area-based conservation, for all its benefits, is not enough to really save the biodiversity crisis. So, you know, I'll say the military here, it seems odd, you know, but they do have big budgets and they do actually manage a lot of land. What's their biodiversity conservation strategy? Shipping and farming are big sectors in our economy. What is their biodiversity conservation strategy? That should be forefront, and we need to talk about that more readily. Needs to integrate through those sectors in order to remove the burden on protected areas on doing all the work. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience, and yeah, if there's any time for questions, I'd love to hear them.